But I'd like to welcome you to another history session by Lou, where we take a look at some of the sex scandal and sleaze that's taken place throughout U.S. history, as well as a lot of those really good things that have happened as well. The topic today is what made the Gilded Age gilded, roughly the period 1870 to 1900, and it was a golden age when many wonderful things happened and new industries emerged and new inventions and so forth. Well, what made it gilded? It's a time when we had robber barons, and so we need to ask ourselves as you listen to this, were the robber barons cruel or selfish? What was their motives? The second question is, why did it happen in the U.S. and no other places in the world? Or did it happen in some other places in the world and we just focused on the U.S. Gilded Age? And finally, should we copy the Gilded Age today for our complicated world that we live in? Would it be to our advantage as a civilization? Well, anyways, you listen and watch this, you ask yourself some of these questions and see what kind of answers you come up with. Anyway, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoy. Today, our topic is one that goes back to the 19th century. And actually, it's important because it shaped the things that are going on in our world today. It's called the Gilded Age. And this is part 1 of 3. Part 2 will expand on the Gilded Age of the 1870 period, 1870 to 1900 roughly. And then we get the third one, we'll deal with the question, are we living in a new Gilded Age? But first we need the background of what the Gilded Age itself was all about, and so that's what we're going to tackle today. It was a time that was glamorous and obscene and ostentatious and at the same time very inhumane, a time of great contrasts. During this time of the Gilded Age, which is roughly 1865 or 1870 to 1900, give or take a couple of years, we had great men like this guy who was very, very rich, and this guy who was very powerful and at the same time very crooked. The one who was rich was Andrew Carnegie. The one who was very powerful and crooked was Boss Tweed from the city of New York. So the Gilded Age was a time when we had the politics of equilibrium, equally divided between different parties in the country. A two-party stalemate, basically. Now, if you look at this map, you will see that the South, with the D's on it, was very solidly Democrat and voted Democrat 4 to 5 times. The gold is Republican, and that voted Republican 4 to 5 times during the period 76 to 92. So it was a two-party stalemate back and forth. And this is a cartoon from the period that shows the Democrats and the Republicans as two quarreling roosters with a scale which had them probably about equal. This is interesting because if you can read the top one is the election of 1876 when 81% of the eligible voters voted. Now, remember in 1876 there were no women voting and only a few African Americans. And so it was just a whole different scene, so to speak, in this country. And it stayed high in 1880 and 1884. But by the time we get down to the bottom in 1920, well, now remember the women have received the vote in 1920, but we fall below half of the people who were eligible to vote voting. There was intense voter loyalty to the two major political parties. They didn't vary much. So I had well-defined voting blocks in this period. The Democratic bloc were white Southerners who wanted to preserve white supremacy. They were a lot of the Catholics, recent immigrants, especially these Jews who came from Southern and Eastern Europe, urban, working, poor, the pro-labor people, and most farmers were Democrat during this period. Now remember, all generalizations are false, including this one, and so it was certainly, there were all kinds of exceptions to all of these rules. The Republican bloc were largely northern whites, pro-business. They were African Americans at that time who voted Republican. They've switched today. Northern Protestants, old WASPs or white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, who had great support for the anti-immigrant laws, which is something we're having to deal with even today. And most of the middle class were then Republican in those days. The Gilded Age had the best and worst of American civilization. Major events, industrial expansion like crazy, just explosive expansion, inventors and inventions. There was the settlement of the West, so that by the time we get to the turn of the century, the whole country is essentially settled, even though, of course, there are large open spaces. The railroad was, among the things, a great symbol of growth and was also a distribution system that worked in two directions. And we had the rise of labor unions during this period. Now, they don't really become powerful until the 1930s, but they're beginning to flex their muscles. We had an extraordinary rise of immigration during this period. Rise of urbanization. We moved from the farm to the city. Political parties took no clear-cut stand on the issues. It was a little bit vague as to what any of them actually stood for. The captains of industry were the political leaders and dictated what should be done. They wanted to protect a laissez-faire system and capitalism. Examples of corruption during this period were rampant, and we'll touch on some of those. During this period, James A. Garfield, a Republican, was president in 1881. He was assassinated by an upset spoilsman, Charles Guiteau. Chester A. Arthur took over as president. He was a Republican, and he's most noted for the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which is really interesting because he was a product of the spoils system coming out of New York, in the city of New York. He reformed the spoils system. Grover Cleveland was president from 85 to 89, then once again to 93 to 97, up until 2024. He was the only president elected to two separate terms. The only Democrat, and he serves those two non-consecutive terms. He had conflicts between business and labor. There was the formation of some labor unions in this period, and very famous incident was the Haymarket riot and the Pullman strike. These were major labor events during this period. All of these things, we have really the first time the government attempted to curb business that had run amok was the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887. Now, it did some good things, but it wasn't very strong. And then we had a major tariff in 1894, and we have a lot of debate about tariffs in our country today, as a matter of fact. Benjamin Harrison, between the two terms of Cleveland, he serves as president. Four major laws were signed during his presidency: the Sherman Antitrust Act, the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, the McKinley Tariff Act, the Dependent Pension Act. This is a very laissez-faire federal government, however. From 1870 to 1900, the government did very little domestically. The main duties of the federal government were limited to deliver the mail, to maintain a national military, which wasn't very large, to collect taxes and tariffs, and that was the main source of income for the government at that time because there was no income tax yet. And they conducted, of course, a foreign policy as well. The exception was to administer the annual Civil War veterans pension, where somebody could get as much as $12 a month. My great-grandfather was a Civil War veteran, and his daughters were always able to wear slightly nicer clothing than some of the girls in the neighborhood because he had a pension that continued with him his entire life. The presidency as a symbolic office. The party bosses ruled. The most famous probably is Senator Roscoe Conkling. The president should avoid offending any factions within their own party. The president just doled out federal jobs. That's the main thing a president did during the 19th century. In 1865, the end of the Civil War, 53,000 people worked for the federal government. By 1900, that had become 166,000 people working for the federal government. President Grant had some scandals, the most famous of which was Crédit Mobilier, phony construction company owned by stockholders of the Union Pacific Railroad. Now, the Crédit Mobilier, of course, is a French term, and it had been a French company, and they simply took it over. It was worthless when they took it over, and they just used it as a vehicle to run their bad, corrupt businesses. It hired Crédit Mobilier to build the Transcontinental Railroad. It charged the U.S. government nearly twice the actual cost of the project, bribed Congress to stop the investigation, the largest scandal in U.S. history, and led to greater public awareness of government corruption. We suddenly knew how corrupt government could be, and this was an example of it. But also, during his term, he had the whiskey ring. A group of President Grant's officials imported whiskey. They used their offices to avoid paying taxes. They cheated the U.S. Treasury out of millions of dollars. There was also a salary grab. The Congress gave itself a raise, $5,000 to $7,500 annually. Now, of course, money went a lot further in those days, so if you think about the percentage of increase, that's significant. Congressmen received a retroactive check for $5,000 plus their raise. Now, the 27th Amendment of the Constitution prohibits this happening now. This is an interesting amendment of the Constitution because it was originally proposed in 1791, but it doesn't actually take effect until we get three-quarters of the states that have ratified it, and that's in about 1991, I recall. Now, Congress cannot raise its salary while it's in session. It can raise the salary of the Congress that will follow them, but not their own salary. Became a political issue, and of course this was later repealed because it was so controversial. This is also the period of the corrupt bargain. Rutherford B. Hayes was the candidate versus Samuel Tilden. The election of 1876 and the Compromise of 1877 are referred to as the corrupt bargain. The Democrats and Republicans worked out a deal to recognize Hayes as the president, even though he had not won the election. In return, Hayes had to end Reconstruction and pull the Union troops out of the South, and he did. And this allowed the Jim Crow laws to flourish and for the South to become very segregationist. Once this happens, there's no protection for the freedmen, and the South regained their states, and they go back to the way it was before the Civil War. Now, this is an illustration of the election, which I think is most interesting. At this time, there were a possible 369 electoral votes. You needed 185 to win. As you can see here, Hayes wound up with 164. Samuel Tilden with 184. He was one vote short of a majority. Tilden did not receive enough electoral votes. In contest were the electoral votes of South Carolina, of Florida, of Louisiana, and of Oregon. A special commission was created, and they gave the votes to Hayes, and Hayes wins the election. Democrats refused to recognize Hayes. I think this is really interesting. That 185 turns into, becomes 164 becomes 185, and guess what? Just enough to win the election. The 1880 presidential election, Democrats Hancock and English. And we have the spoils system, which had really flourished under Andrew Jackson and all the presidents before. Hayes was elected in 1876. He reformed the civil service, appointing qualified political independents instead of giving position to supporters. No congressional support from the Republican Party. Hayes, of course, as a result, did not seek a second term. President James A. Garfield, in his 1880 election, the Republicans were split into three factions. The stalwarts, who defended the spoils system, headed up by Senator Roscoe Conkling. The half-breed reform, but still supported it, Senator James Blaine, and the independents who opposed the spoils system. Garfield wanted reforms. His running mate was Chester Arthur, a stalwart. July 2nd, 1881, Garfield was assassinated by a stalwart who wanted Arthur as president. So here is a map showing the distribution of the electoral vote during the 1880 election. You can see the North is, with the blue, is Republican, and the South and the red is Democrat. President Garfield's assassination was by an upset spoilsman, Charles Guiteau. He wanted the spoils system, and this led to Vice President Chester Arthur becoming president. Arthur, who was a product himself of the spoils system in New York, now he supported a change to the corrupt spoils system, and he signed into law the Pendleton Act, also called the Civil Service Act. It required candidates applying for government positions to take a test to determine their qualifications. Under the spoils system, which was patronage, in other words, candidates for political office would offer potential jobs in exchange for votes, gave the supporters access to money and political favors. During the Gilded Age, the Republicans and Democrats had roughly the same number of supporters. To keep party members loyal, candidates rewarded supporters and tried to avoid controversial issues. They tiptoed around a lot of them. The Republicans appealed to the industrialists, bankers, and Eastern farmers. They favored the gold standard, sound money it was called, and high tariffs. Blue laws, regulations that prohibited certain activities people considered immoral. The Democrats attracted the less privileged groups, such as the northern urban immigrants, laborers, southern planters, and the western farmers. They supported soft money and silver coinage. This became one of the major issues of the 19th century. And then in 1881, Garfield is assassinated. Charles Guiteau screamed out, "I am a stalwart, and Arthur is president now." In actuality, Garfield was taken to the White House, and he was treated by doctors who in those days did not wash their hands, and probably it was their treatment of him that he survived for, I think, 90 days or thereabouts, and he finally died, but it was probably their diseased hands that were causing the problem because they probed inside of his wound, and it was just not what you would consider today. He would probably have survived if it had happened today. Was Chester A. Arthur a fox in the chicken coop? This is a famous cartoon from the period, which shows, you see, Arthur way over on the left, and then the other characters who were important during this period. And it was all really, they were all worshiping at the god of patronage. Pendleton Act of 1883, the Civil Service Act, is called the Magna Carta of Civil Service Reform. 14,000 out of the 117,000 federal jobs became civil service exam positions. Still a long ways to go, but it was a good beginning. By 1900, 100,000 out of the 200 civil service federal jobs were, 100,000 out of 200,000 civil service federal jobs. So the reforming the civil service, employees on the payroll, you see how it grew from 1830 all the way to 1891, and Arthur reformed it, and you see the change here, the portion of federal employees under the Civil Service Commission, and you see that that changes dramatically between 1883 and 1897. Laissez-faire, an economic belief supported by the U.S. that opposes the government regulating business, and that's what we practiced for pretty much the first 100 years of our nationhood. In the late 1800s, businesses operated without much government regulation, and of course it was laissez-faire. It meant allowed to be, that's what the term means in French, or the government stays out of your business. Laissez-faire supports our economic system of capitalism untrampled, unrestrained. From 1870 to 1900, the government did very little domestically, and I told you this before. They delivered the mail, they maintained a national military, collected taxes and tariffs, conducted a foreign policy, and they also administered the annual Civil War veterans pension. Republican mugwumps, reformers who wouldn't renominate Chester A. Arthur. Reform to them created a disinterested, impartial government run by an ill-educated elite like themselves. They were really social Darwinists. Laissez-faire government to them meant favoritism and the spoils system seen as government intervention in society. Their target was political corruption, not social or economic reform. So what is the word mugwump? A mugwump is a great American mugwump. He sits on a fence with his mug on one side and his wump on the other. They were right in the middle. They were political activists who were intensely opposed to political corruption. They were never formally organized, however, and typically they switched parties from the Republican Party by supporting Cleveland in the 1884 election. The mugwumps. Men may come and men may go, but the work of reform shall go on forever. And here you see a cartoon of the period which is explaining things. And in those days, not everybody could read as well as they can today. And so often these cartoons that are quite involved really were sending multiple messages at the same time. They supported Cleveland in the 1884 election. And here were the candidates: Grover Cleveland, the Democrat, and James Blaine, the Republican. It was a dirty campaign. This is the first time a presidential campaign had been as openly dirty as this. At one time, Cleveland had fathered a child out of wedlock. And so this phrase was running around: "Ma, Ma, where's my pa? He's going to the White House. Ha, ha, ha." He survived, however. A little lost mugwump, he's called, Blaine, in 1884, another cartoon that explains the people he's leading and why they're leading them. Rum, romanticism, and rebellion. Dr. Samuel Burchard. He led a delegation of ministers to Blaine in New York City, attacked the Democrats as the party of rum, romanticism, and rebellion, reference to the Democratic Party. Blaine was slow to repudiate the remark, and there was a narrow victory for Cleveland, and he won New York by only 1,149 votes. That's all it took. The 1884 presidential election, here you see again that solid South that's red, with New York and Connecticut, New Jersey thrown in, and the blue were the Republicans in this case. Blaine, and he lost. And of course, because Cleveland had that solid South plus New York thrown into the mix, it was enough to win. Cleveland's first term, he was called the veto governor from New York. And when I used to describe him in contrast to McKinley, who followed him, is that Cleveland was Mr. No. He said no to a lot of things, and he started that as vetoing in New York. And Mr. McKinley, so President McKinley, was Mr. Yes, because he agreed to a lot of things that had been stalled. He was the first Democrat elected since 1856. A public office is a public trust, he said. His laissez-faire presidency opposed bills to assist the poor as well as the rich. He vetoed over 200 special pension bills for Civil War veterans, and they were a large power during this period. The Civil War veterans, the Grand Army of the Republic was an organization, and so is Bravo Signor Calivando, is another cartoon from the period which shows him conquering democracy, really, with his vetoes and so forth. After the Civil War, Congress raised tariffs to protect new U.S. industries. Big business wanted to continue this. Consumers did not, because tariffs wind up with higher prices for consumers. And we're finding out that in 2025 in America, we have a real problem with this going on again. In 1885, tariffs earned the U.S. $100 million in surplus. The mugwumps opposed it, but why? Well, President Cleveland's view on tariffs became a major issue in the 1888 presidential election. So, the tariff issue. Cleveland believed high tariffs were harmful and should be reduced. He argued that high tariffs led to higher prices on all products and that they brought in more money than the government needed. Cleveland promoted reduced high protective tariffs and ran for his second term on a platform advocating for lower tariffs. His efforts were largely ineffective due to the strong support for high tariffs among influential businessmen and industrialists, kind of like our high-tech executives today who have a disproportionate influence on government. Despite Cleveland's efforts, the Republican Party, led by Benjamin Harrison, won the 1888 election by emphasizing their support for higher tariffs. Harrison's victory led to a brief return to higher tariffs and a strengthening of the spoils system. Now here's another cartoon from the period, and it's called Filing the Rough Edges, and they're trying to make that tariff 1888 much more acceptable, and of course Cleveland's motto, public office is a public trust, was there. Mr. No, Cleveland. The 1888 presidential election, Grover Cleveland was facing Benjamin Harrison. And here is the result of that election, in which the Solid South, of course, stayed Democrat and the North, this time, became Republican. And so it was another flip-flopping from region to the two regions. Eventually, this will be different, of course, in our modern time. And here is the election results by electoral vote. And of course, the electoral votes have shifted around from time to time. Coming out for Harrison, another cartoon from the period in which the bosses are making the workers vote as they want them to vote. Sort of a monopoly, that you vote the way I want you to vote or you aren't going to get your paycheck. In other words, it was coercion. This is from the famous magazine of the period called Puck. Smallest specimen yet. Harrison was not regarded very highly even while he was president. Disposing the surplus. So the $100,000 surplus that Cleveland left around in 1888, what happened to it? A billion-dollar hole that Harrison dumped it into. So there's changing public opinion. Americans wanted the federal government to deal with the growing social and economic problems and to curb the power of the trusts, because the trusts have become enormous. And so one preliminary act is the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887. So after all of these years, they finally began to control things. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, McKinley Tariff of 1890, based on the theory that prosperity flowed directly from protectionism, which is what a tariff is supposed to do, at least in part. Increased already high rates another 4%. Now today, the current president's talking about 25 and 50% and sometimes 100% increases. At this time, it was already controversial to do 4%. The Republican Party suffered big losses in 1890, and McKinley, who'd been Speaker of the House, even lost his House seat. 1892 presidential election. Grover Cleveland faced off again against Benjamin Harrison, the Republican. In 1892, Mr. No won again, this time by getting the state of New York and Connecticut and so forth, and so he's able to prevail in this election. Cleveland loses support fast, however. It was not a honeymoon. He's the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms until 2024. Blamed for the 1893 panic. The Panic of 1893 was the second worst in our history. Only the Great Depression of the 1930s was worse. He defended the gold standard, used federal troops in the 1894 Pullman strike. In other words, taking federal troops against U.S. citizens, which made it controversial. Refused to sign the Wilson-Gorman Tariff of 1894. Mr. No, remember, repealed the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, the gold standard that he wanted. Capitalism. Capitalism is an economic system characterized by private property ownership. Individuals and companies compete for their own economic game. That's called profit. It's good. Capitalists determine the price of goods and services. Production and distribution are privately or corporately owned. And then there is a reinvestment of the profits so that the company can grow again. Capitalism is a good thing, and most of the time it works right, and it supports laissez-faire, leave it alone, but there are times when it can be abusive, and so it needs to be controlled, as we have done more currently now. Socialism, on the other hand, is the economic system based on cooperation rather than competition. It believes in government ownership of businesses and capital. The government controls the production and distribution of goods. It's the opposite of laissez-faire and capitalism. And there are today mixed capitalist and socialist kinds of elements in what we do. And here we come, President McKinley is the president then who defeats Cleveland, or who serves after Cleveland as his second term. And William McKinley, Mr. Yes, he says yes to a lot of things, including the annexation of Hawaii. His vice president is Theodore Roosevelt. President McKinley then was just re-elected in 1900. He was beginning his second term when he was assassinated in 1901, and his vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, becomes the president. So why did the Gilded Age end then? Robber barons amassed vast fortunes during the age that began at the start of the Civil War and ended with the crash of 1893. The Gilded Age dawned at the end of the Civil War as railroads raced to connect the country. Robber barons amassed fortunes in unregulated industries like oil and steel. Mark Twain coined the term Gilded Age in a novel satirizing the corruption that lay behind America's new prosperity. The name stuck, but the good times didn't. As Gilded Age mansions like the Breakers in Newport and the Biltmore in Asheville rose, so too did discontent over rampant income inequality. The Gilded Age came crashing down with the panic of 1893, which set off an economic depression that ushered in the sweeping reforms of the Progressive Era. Here are 5 reasons the Gilded Age came to a close. First of all, the panic of 1893. The depression set off by the failure of the 2 largest employers in the country, the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad and the National Cordage Company. The stock market plummeted as businesses that had borrowed heavily to invest in railroads went bankrupt. The value of crops in the American South and West fell, and unemployment rose as high as 19%. So, the crash threw the power of the wealthy and the powerlessness of labor into stark relief. The panic of 1893 showed that this notion of a laissez-faire, unregulated economy was not working. It never worked for the poor, but it took the panic of the idea to hit the middle class, who had the most to lose. And then there was also number 2, the muckrakers exposed corruption. Muckrakers were journalists who exposed corrupt politicians and businesses. In some cases, their work led to reform. Ida Tarbell most famously exposed the John D. Rockefeller Standard Oil Company and led to a U.S. Supreme Court case that found it violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, a novel revealing the rotten side of the meat industry in Chicago, led to the 1906 passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. Political cartoons by artists like Thomas Mass skewered Tammany Hall, Crédit Mobilier, and the whiskey ring scandal surrounding President Ulysses Grant. Muckrakers sensationalized an already growing discontent with the power the corruptions were exercising. Populism and the Civil Rights. Populists advocated for shorter workdays, a graduated income tax, and government ownership of commodities like railroads and telephones. They were largely farmers fed up with the government's favoritism of big business. Gilded Age America was a very different nation than the rural agricultural one prior to the Civil War. During the Second Industrial Revolution, inventions like electricity and the rise of factories and railroads led to an unprecedented migration of goods and people to cities. By 1900, 30% of the U.S. population lived in urban areas. Farmers grew dependent on railroads to transport their wares, meaning railroad executives controlled both access to markets and prices. Many farmers wanted to increase the cost of their goods by basing U.S. currency not just on gold, but silver, which was much more abundant and flexible. Silverism was a major topic in the election of 1896 when Republican William McKinley faced off against Democratic rising star William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan, nicknamed the Great Commoner, was catapulted into the spotlight after a speech at the Democratic Convention denouncing the gold standard as a cross of gold the working man was forced to bear. While Bryan lost, he gave voice to many who felt left out of Gilded Age's prosperity, and most of the things that were advocated eventually were enacted, like the income tax. Progressive era reforms. Progressives believed that the task of righting society's ills lay with the government, not with private citizens. The rise of big business and its power and influence had never been seen before in this country or the world, said Wall. Progressive laws and social reform movements were part of creating a new language to understand and shape it. While titans of industry like Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, and John D. Rockefeller grew lavish fortunes, 40% of industrial laborers in the 1880s had incomes below the poverty line. Progressives pushed for workers' rights and housing and sanitation reforms. They supported expanding voting rights and women's suffrage to limit the ability of corporations. Progressives pushed for workers' rights and housing sanitation reform, supported expanding voting rights and women's suffrage to limit the ability of corporations to buy power through bribes, kickbacks, and graft. And then there was Theodore Roosevelt. The real end of the Gilded Age came with the assassination of William McKinley. McKinley was a popular two-term president, fresh off winning the Spanish-American War when he was assassinated in 1901. McKinley's vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, was a moderate when he took power, remembered for progressive legislation and a reputation as a trust buster. People were critical of progressives, painting them as weak supporters of a nanny state. Nobody could ever accuse Roosevelt of being weak, however. Roosevelt cultivated a hyper-masculine image that helped him reach across the political aisle. He met with both big coal and labor during the 1902 coal strike and oversaw such progressive legislation as the Pure Food and Drug and the creation of national parks. So the progressive era then began. Gilded Age technology and wealth transformed America into a world power, but left wealth in the hands of a few. Progressive era reforms expanded the government to ensure Roosevelt's words, a square deal for all. And so that is the end of the discussion for today. Ensuring the future is up to all of us. And when we take a look at part 2, you will discover there's much more to the Gilded Age than we've explored in this first presentation. I look forward to you joining me. Thanks for being with us today. Oh yes, one more thing. Please remember to hit the subscribe and like button so I can be encouraged to create more History by Lou just for you on these YouTube presentations. Thanks for watching.